Good afternoon, everybody. I was going to say it's nice to see you, but it's pretty bright up here. I think I've seen outside quite a few familiar faces, which is always nice, but also a lot of yellow lanyards this time, so it's good to see a whole load of new faces as well. Obviously, from our perspective, get to talk to some new people. I wanted to sort of carry on and sort of our sort of typical thread of just giving you some education and some understanding of what's going on in the threat landscape. As I've said before, I don't want to talk about product as such, but want to talk about what we're seeing as far as DDoS attacks from our perspective, how they're evolving, how things are changing over time. If I just get my clicker. So I used this slide back in January for anyone who remembers, and for any of you who were here back then. And I was talking about sort of this, let's say, slight revolution in the DDoS landscape, and this was with respect to using botnets. Botnets, obviously nothing new about botnets in themselves, but botnets build out of IoT devices to launch DDoS attacks. And that was something that we'd seen in the sort of the last quarter of 2016, came up around the sort of surfaced around the sort of October time. And obviously when we're talking about back in January, it's a fairly new phenomenon. Now, because of the way we've seen this evolve, we expected that this would be something that wouldn't go away, and surprise, surprise, it hasn't. So what I wanted to talk about this time is what's going on there. Now, it's obviously no surprise once you understand that IoT devices are getting used for this type of attack vector, why that would continue to be used. Analysts like Gartner are predicting 20 billion, I mean the numbers vary from, I don't know, 15 billion to way over this, but somewhere in the order of that number of IoT devices on the internet by 2020. And when you look at the mechanisms, and this is some of the things I'm going to talk about that have been used to recruit these IoT devices into botnets, you can understand why it's such an attractive mechanism for attackers to use. Now, I said it first appeared back in October, and many of you will have seen it in the press. I mean, the word Mirai in association with the name of this botnet when it first arose back then has been well publicised and used in many articles. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because we, as one of the vendors that spends a lot of time looking at new attack vectors like that to ensure that we're giving the best possible protection against them, we've done quite a lot of research into it. So I wanted to give you some insight into that. And I also wanted to show you some of the new vectors that have been kind of leveraged on the back of that. That code was not only used to launch these large attacks back in October, but the code was, quite quickly after those attacks, was made public to the hacker community. And when you see the detail behind how that's constructed, you see why it's very easy for other attackers to actually leverage the same mechanism or use the idea, the concept that was created for that botnet to actually use that to do variations on that, to do different types of attacks, or to use those botnets in a different way. And really, that combined with other things we've seen, I said that there's these new attacks that we've seen most recently. A couple of them I'm going to talk about here is this ELF image and amnesia. I'll talk a little bit about those, but you can see there's lots of similarities with that original code that came from the Mirai botnet. These combined with more traditional attack vectors really has continued that rise in the size and scale and frequency of DDoS attacks that we've seen increasing significantly over the last 3 to 5 years. So as I said, this Mirai attack botnet really was a game changer. It's one of those things, when you look at it, the detail behind it, although it's kind of caused a bit of a revolution, there's nothing that special about the individual components that go together to make it. The technology behind it is sort of more of an evolution. But it's more of a sort of a light bulb moment for other attackers in the community, other hackers in the community to say, okay, that's an interesting way of creating attacks compared to my traditional ways of attacking sites using DDoS, things like amplification, application reflection techniques, things like that. Moving to harness an IoT botnet that's nicely harnessed, ready there, waiting to be used without the users knowing that it's going on, to be able to recruit that and target particular individuals, particular organizations in a very controlled way is very appealing. So how did the Mirai botnet get constructed? Well, actually, I said it was, it's fairly evolutionary, but it's actually a reasonably complex system. There's 4 individual components in the botnet itself. There's the bot itself, which is written in C, and this is designed to target IoT devices, primarily using something called BusyBox. If anyone's familiar with that, effectively it's a very lightweight version of Linux designed to run on IoT devices that by definition have very low processing power, very small amounts of memory on them. So it's effectively more like a Linux toolkit. It takes the very core functions of Linux that you need to create the operating system to actually be able to deliver the functionality of the IoT device, but nothing else. So it focuses on being able to attack those devices. Once a device has been compromised, it calls back home to a command and control center. So that's pretty standard operation for any botnet. But one of the things that was different about Mirai was once a device is infected, it becomes self-propagating. So not only does the device phone home to the command and control center, it also starts looking for other devices that it can infect. And I don't know if you remember back as something I sort of talked about back in January, one of the things that makes Mirai really effective, and this is kind of one of the light bulb moments effectively, was the fact that it just used commonly known default passwords that are implemented on IoT devices. Some IoT devices have virtually no security, and the ones that do have some typically always ship with some kind of default username and password. And if you look at the list at the bottom here, you may have to look at the slides later. I think that's probably a little small here. But as I said before, they're fairly common username password combinations that are built in. Admin password, root password, that sort of thing. But also, if you look more closely at the list, there's some very specific ones as well, which kind of says that the botnet's not just going after any old generic IoT device, it's targeting certain types of IoT devices. So there's some very specific username and password combinations, and you can look at those later. But that kind of indicates and ties up with the fact that certainly Mirai itself has targeted very specific types of IoT devices up till now. And I guess it's picked on the ones that were sort of, the first sort of easy pickings, which happen to be things like digital CCTV cameras and the DVR, digital recording boxes, that sit behind those. And a lot of these username passwords relate specifically to those. And when the botnet actually finds another device to compromise, and I said this is, it's quite a complex system, Mirai, the 4 components. When it finds a new device, it reports back to something called the scan listen process. And that scan listen process is waiting for existing bots in the net to report back and say, I've found a new device that I'm going to compromise. And it then signals to something called the loader process, which is then designed to install the malware on the next compromised device and then add that to the botnet. So it's a fairly complex system. And I think you can imagine that when you first initiate the botnet, the speed at which it's going to start acquiring these devices, and when you see that we're talking about tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of devices of the type it's targeting, you can imagine the initial rate is pretty fast. So you need a system that can kind of keep up with that and then have like a scheduling process to do the compromise of the devices. And once the botnet's created, it comes from a DDoS perspective, the Mirai botnet, for example, comes pre-canned with a whole bunch of specific DDoS attack vectors it can use. And if you look down the list, there's some fairly straightforward UDP and TCP type flood attack vectors that are listed here. But there's also, again, there's some more specific ones. There's ones that attack, like, for example, the Valve source engine query. That's for the Valve's Steam multiplayer online gaming system. So it's specifically designed as an attack to effectively attack that type of environment so that gamers can use it to take other gamers offline, for example. And there's more sophisticated ones that have particular sort of mitigation mechanisms in. There's a variation on the ACK flood attack, which waits for the first sequence number to come back, which can actually fool some fairly simple DDoS protection mechanisms. So you can see that the designer of the botnet's not just thinking about what's the simplest way they can go about things, they're also thinking about how can they evade some detection that's already been put in place. Now, I said that I was going to talk about some of the newer sort of follow-on attacks that have been created on the back of that. So, remember Mirai was back in October last year, so we get to April now, we're sort of 6 or 7 months down the line. That's a long while for other attackers who have looked at how Mirai was constructed and maybe either leveraged it or created something of their own using similar techniques. And fairly recently, over the last maybe month or so, we've seen a couple of new variants that have come to light from some of the various security research teams that are out there. One's called Elf Image, and the other one was called an Amnesia. And what you can see from these, back to my point about targeting specific types of IoT devices, because it's easy to know how to get into those particular devices, i.e. either with a specific user password default, or in these cases with particular vulnerabilities. And you see, whichever one you're targeting, you only have to pick one particular device type because there's so many of them out there on the internet. You see 130,000 of these cameras or 200-odd thousand of these DVRs. So it's very easy with a fairly limited set of either username passwords or a very specific vulnerability that you can exploit a huge number of devices and create a very sizable botnet pretty easily. In both of these cases, you can see one of them was exploiting a remote code execution vulnerability, and the other one was a command injection. But fairly standard types of exploitation mechanisms that malware authors have been using for years now. So it's very easy for them to translate that from infecting users' endpoint devices to using those same mechanisms to infect IoT devices. So, how can we deal with this? This isn't going to go away. As we've seen, the scale to which the IoT is evolving, the number of devices that are increasingly internet-enabled, that's not going to change. That's not going away. So as a community, we can do something about it. We can deploy DDoS protection mechanisms that enable us to provide DDoS-protected services to our customers, and that's something that we of Carrera have talked about at previous UKNOF sessions. Being able to take a DDoS protection solution and enable you to deploy that as a service that you can generate incremental revenue for yourselves while providing solid protection for your customers. We could wait for the device manufacturers to do something about it, but many of these IoT devices are incredibly low cost. As we said, the Linux code is being written specifically because, or specific versions are being written because there's very little processing power and very little memory, and that's all about keeping costs down. So being able to, thinking that there would be some wholesale change to start adding significant security on top of those devices, you can't really see that happening anytime soon, if at all. Maybe one thing that the vendors could do is maybe get away with the default password situation and force people to have to set their own password each time they get a new device out of the box before they connect it to the internet, but it's not going to get rid of some of those other vulnerabilities. The amount of code testing that's required to stop those command injection or those remote code execution vulnerabilities, the attackers will always be one step ahead trying to find those, and it's the same for Windows or Mac-based endpoints. We've had antivirus on those for years, but the attackers still find new ways to infect those, and I don't think that's going to be any different for IoT devices either. It may mean that there's government legislation that's required. Can't see that coming anytime soon. Maybe the industry can do more. So recently there's a couple of carriers, things like AT&T and Nokia, together with, I think, Palo Alto Networks and a couple of other security vendors have tried to form a cybersecurity alliance to try and find ways to help deal with this. Well, I think we probably have to keep our eyes on that and see whether something useful comes out. That's still only in its very early stages. One thing that I couldn't resist putting in, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's sort of only came out in the last week or so I had to slip it in at the last minute, was Brickerbot. Probably not the answer. Sounds great on the surface. It's a Mirai derivative, kind of like a vigilante, and it's going out there looking for these easy-to-compromise devices and just wiping files off them and basically disabling them. Well, that might seem like a great idea on the surface. If it's your refrigerator goes down, maybe that's just a bit annoying. But there could be mechanisms where they could, tackle internet-enabled light bulbs and CCTV cameras, and shut that down and then go and physically, raid a bank or something. But more seriously, it could be an internet-enabled car, or it could be a medical device. Then it's lives at risk if you start doing that. So obviously that's not the answer. So I think we think back to the previous slide, and as an industry, there's things that we can do that can help to stop this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. We've probably got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if they're relatively short. We've got one down here.
Through the bright light.
Carl, just over there.
Hi, Carlos in KDA Web Services. Do you not think the CPE providers, like that provided by Sky, BT, etc., have a bit more of a duty to help protect against these things? So if we're talking about UDP spoofing, those CPEs know what IPs they're responsible for, and if they're spoofing a UDP for a reflection attack, do they not have a bit more responsibility towards that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, that you could put them into the community if there's that would definitely help. But that spoofing doesn't stop. That doesn't stop all of the attacks.
Oh no, I appreciate it's not a magic golden bullet, but it's a big part of the problem.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, they could definitely be included in my last but one slide.
Dave was just a bit faster.
No, he wasn't.
Yeah, he was. Go on, Neil. What would you like to say, Neil? Come on.
No, I mean, so I think our last 2 hubs have got anti-spoofing in it, but the previous ones, some of these attacks are new. You don't know them about the time. We don't own the code. We can't even update it. People who built it are not there. So we do work with customers when we identify them to swap them out, but it's a heavy lift. But I also think in my mind, it's easy to say, oh yeah, it's all BT or Sky. But actually, it's people like PC World who are selling thermometers that take 10 seconds thermostats that take 10 seconds to compromise. There needs to be a much more wider. Everybody needs to be part of this to fix this, because we talk about off-the-shelf products, but we had a thing with a boiler that God knows what could be hacked there. So everybody needs to play a part in our community.
Okay. Dave, very quickly.
Just very quickly, Dave Freeman from Klarna. I'd just like to do the obligatory plug for Manners, the URL I'm putting in the IRC now. If you're not subscribed to it, go check this page out, read it, and join our community. This is a group of service providers who would like to implement common sets of security standards to protect the routing system. And one of those principles that we underpin is the prevention of spoofed traffic originating from your network.
Okay, thank you. The Carrera are a premium sponsor, so if you've got any more questions for Sean, grab them out there.
Yeah, and we'll be sponsoring the beer later, so
excellent.
Come and talk to us over a beer.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks.